Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran and this is episode 18, the Chalukyas, part 5. After Pulakesin II defeated and killed his uncle Mangalesha in the Battle of Elpattu Simbighe to get back his rightful inheritance, which was the throne of the Chalukya Empire, the kingdom was, predictably, roiled in tension. The transition couldn't have been easy for young Pulakesin. His trial by fire, to use a cliché, started almost immediately after Elpattu Simbighe, when he was challenged to battle by two men, Apayika and Govinda, who sought to carve out a part of the northern Chalukya kingdom for themselves. Pulakesin successfully put down that threat and, victorious in these back-to-back battles, returned to Vatapi, his capital, to start his reign. Pulakesin's time as ruler was a sort of watershed time in the history of the Deccan, when international relations went from merely trade to international diplomacy. This was also the time when the famous Chinese scholar Xuanzang stopped by Vatapi in his travels through India, and we learned much more about Pulakesin's kingdom from his writings. It was a great time in history to be a fly on the wall, but what we're doing here is second best as I share with you my discovery of all that happened in that time. But first, I must pause and thank the Prestige Group, my sponsors, for their generosity in making this podcast possible. Building cities, one landmark at a time, they turn dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. And now let's teleport ourselves back to the year 610 AD, and let's imagine how the scene unfolded. The township of Vatapi, presently Badami, would have been agog, anticipating the arrival of their new king, the young and charismatic Pulakesin II. Messengers or runners would already have brought the townsfolk and the palace officials news of the killing of their ruler, Mangalesha, and the defeat of the challengers, Apayika and Govinda. Broadcasting this news to the public would have been the job of the town criers, who would have got all the details from the messengers and then gathered the people of Vatapi in a public place and intoned the news. Shortly after, criers and the local messengers would have set out to different parts of the kingdom to deliver the news to the local people in every village and town. Over at the palace, the messengers would have delivered the news directly to the assembled nobility, the palace women, the queen, the consorts, and all their children, the palace officials, the council of ministers, and everyone who worked at the palace. Predictably, the news must have rattled everyone, melodrama running unchecked, the gnashing of teeth, the wailing, the breast beating at the death of their king Mangalesha. But underlying all that, an eerie sense of anticipation, some trepidation, some excitement, everyone at the palace trying to figure out their place in the new scheme of things, remembering the presence of the young Pulakesin before he took exile and left the kingdom, silently vowing revenge upon his treacherous uncle. Each person trying to establish who had been closest to Pulakesin, and who were the spies among them who may have been unfaithful to Mangalesha. Equally, while all this emotion was going on, the palace's council of elders would have met with a more sober consideration. How to deal with the instability and possibly threats from invaders in the wake of a regime change. Soldiers left behind to defend the capital from surprise attacks must have been on high alert. The return of Pulakesin must have been exciting. For one, his army must have bloated in size. After the Battle of Elpattu Simbighe, it stands to reason that the very forces who were fighting him for Mangalesha would have, in the single moment that Mangalesha fell to his death in battle, become the army of Pulakesin. 1 minute there was a raging battle and thousands being killed. The very next minute there was only one side, and all the forces were his. So the army that marched back to Vatapi would have included the surviving forces who marched out of Vatapi under the command of Mangalesha, as well as all the troops who would have joined Pulakesin's army when he was in exile, returning to take jobs as a part of the standing army of the Badami Chalukyas. The first cry of spotting the returning army would have been from one of the sentries on the hill fort. The movie plays out quite easily in one's mind. Everything must have come to a halt in Vatapi, everyone dropping what they were doing, running outside for the arrival of the new king. And as the army marched through the village gates, there would have been thousands of families of the soldiers scanning the faces of the troops in a mix of anticipation and dread, not wanting to hear that a father or a husband would never be coming home, his body lying on the bloody battlefields of Elpattu Simbighe, carrion being consumed by wild animals and vultures. Not all tales of war are glorious. As Ernest Hemingway once wrote, no catalogue of its horrors have kept man from war. And throughout history, lives of ordinary people, men economically enslaved into the bearing of arms, have been sacrificed for the greed, the glory, and the vanity of a few men. And whenever history has given them the opportunity, women. It is the lives of these few men and women that make it to the records of history. And here we are, at the end of life of Mangalesha and the start of Pulakesin's reign. The big question that would have occupied the minds of the palace elders was this: was Pulakesin up to the task? Stepping into the void created by Mangalesha's death could not have been easy. Mangalesha had been no ordinary force. Besides, he had been a man so wedded to his legacy that he maintained a very high public visibility until his death. But as the record of history goes, it is said that the available information about Mangalesha would have been vast, much more vast and much more deep than it is, but for the most part, his legitimacy as a Chalukya ruler was never recognized, and he was left out of much of the narrative that follows. Still, he had racked up enough public information for us to be able to build quite a story about this man. Now, Pulakesin was not a man to spend his time ruminating on the life and times of an uncle he had recently killed in battle. And even if he had successfully overcome the threat posed by the two men, Apaika and Govinda, at the battle near the Bhima River in the Bijapur area, he needed to move forward to build his own legacy. He needed to consolidate his position as king and then consolidate and expand the kingdom. Was this an easy task? Typically, the confusion in the wake of war, and civil war in this case, includes an all-round display of opportunism with feudatories looking to strike out on their own. With Mangalesha gone, the Kadambas and some other smaller feudatory kingdoms, including the Yalupas and the Chalukyas and the Mauryas of Konkana, had reacted to the civil war. Some accounts say they went so far as to withdraw their allegiance. And this brings me to an interesting thought. Exactly how bad for Pulakesin were things after Mangalesha's death? Ravi Kirti's Aihole inscription, the only real source of any information about Pulakesin, might be misunderstood to indicate that he was a tour de force who flattened everything in his path and stamped out any opposition. Some might assume that the underlying impression that he was never in any real trouble and always in control. But Ravi Kirti had, within the span of a few verses, pretty much indicated that Pulakesin assumed the throne to some very dark moments. Take, for example, what we do know, the Banas switching allegiances to the Pallavas soon after helping Pulakesin win the Battle of Elpattu Simbighe. The open threat by Apaika and Govinda, who may well have been Rashtrakutas, and almost every feudatory turning their backs on Pulakesin. In his essay, historian D.C. Sarkar writes, the civil war between Mangalesha and Pulakesin II resulted in a widespread renunciation of allegiance by nearly all the communities that had been subdued by the valor of Kirtivarman I and Mangalesha. Clearly, Pulakesin had his hands full, and he set out with his plan to bring everything and everyone back in control. A commercial break now, but when I come back, Pulakesin attacks the Kadambas. Right after this.
Just how the North Star is the guiding light, the star of North Bangalore, Prestige Camden Gardens is a guiding light where your search for the perfect home ends. Prestige Camden Gardens, the star of North Bangalore. Step up to luxury with 3 and 4 BHK apartments on Tanisandra Main Road, 10 minutes from Manyata Tech Park, 25 minutes from the airport, and well connected with other parts of the city. Prestige Camden Gardens. Prices starting from 2.25 crore onwards. To know more, visit prestigeconstructions.com. RERA approved.
Now, we don't know if it was a part of Pulakesin's overall strategy or that we are saying this in hindsight, but there were 4 parts to Pulakesin's plan. First, bring the feudatories under control. Second, focus on the northwest of the country. This is where the famous war with Harshavardhana features. Third, expand and consolidate towards the east. And when the core of the kingdom and its immediate vicinity were his, item number 4, focus on the south. Some of this overlapped with the first part, asserting his authority over feudatories because they existed in different cardinal directions. Pulakesin's first target was Banavasi, the capital of the Kadamba dynasty, with good reason. If you listen to my episode on the history of the Kadambas, you would learn of that dynasty having been in decline for a very long time during this period. At the peak of the Kadamba power, the Chalukya leaders before Pulakesin I, his father Ranaraga and grandfather Jaisamma, were feudatories of the Kadambas. But towards 540 AD, taking advantage of a weakened Kadamba empire, Pulakesin I, in an act of defiance, declared independence from the Kadambas and claimed for himself Vatapi and the surrounding areas and became the first sovereign emperor of the Chalukya dynasty. An ineffectual Kadamba dynasty not only did not oppose this declaration of independence, but progressively lost ground to the Chalukyas. And in later years, Kirtivarman I invaded Banavasi, taking it all but a name. And this may mean that he had left them with a smidgen of sovereignty. But in the wake of the civil war, the Kadambas had reacted, trying to establish some independence, and Pulakesin was not having any of it. He wanted to put an end to any semblance of their independent status. So he marched on the Kadambas and completed the job that his father and grandfather had started a half a century earlier. Finishing off the Kadambas and taking all their land would be a substantial addition to the Chalukyas. In the northern territories, the Kadambas were the big fish. So when Pulakesin decided to march upon the Kadambas, he went straight to the capital Banavasi and laid siege to it. The size of the army that Pulakesin took with him to invade Banavasi must have been massive. One account offered the description that the fort at Banavasi, which is landlocked, seemed like the land on which it stood was covered by the vast expanse of Pulakesin's army. The scene appeared to the observer as if it had been transformed into a fortress rising from the water. The Kadambas must have sensed that this was the end. Confronted with this dire threat to their very existence, they fought valiantly. But to no good use, they lost the battle for Banavasi, and with it, their entire kingdom. After Pulakesin delivered this terrible blow to the main Kadamba family, he set about mopping up every branch of the Kadambas ruling elsewhere, and thus Pulakesin II decisively extinguished the remnants of the Kadamba dynasty. This led to the complete dissolution of the Kadamba rule, leaving little trace of them. No more history, no more coinage, no more inscriptions. And thus, one of the biggest kingdoms of the Deccan vanished into obscurity. To make sure that there was no question of the Kadambas regrouping and trying to make a comeback, Pulakesin split the Kadamba kingdom into 2 large territories and handed control of them to the Alupas and the Sendrakas. The Alupas, who were feudatories of the Kadambas, were granted the Kadamba Mandala, and that means the majority of the Kadamba kingdom, while the Sendrakas received control over a division of Banavasi. The Chiplun plates have a description of this grant. As a scholarly or at least academic aside, there is some debate about whether the Alupas were not the Chalukyas who ruled near the old Shivamogga area and not the Alupas on the west coast. But that is still a debate, and thus, without shooting a single arrow Pulakesin brought these two kingdoms into his fold, the Alupas and the Sendrakas, and also eliminated any chance of a Kadamba revival. Next, he turned his attention to the Mauryas of Konkana. When the Mauryas had declared, like the other feudatories in the wake of the civil war, that they were withdrawing their allegiance, they appeared large as Pulakesin's next target. In a previous episode, we went over how Mangalesha had taken naval battleships to Revati Dvipa or Goa and subjugated that provincial leader. That area came under the control of the Mauryas of Konkana. And earlier to that, Pulakesin's father had subjugated Konkana, which is the principality about 100 kilometers north of Mumbai, and controlled an important port called Puri. The Mauryas, who are said to bear a faint relationship with the famous Mauryas of centuries before, were acting as feudatories of Chalukyas until the civil war. The Aihole Prashasti is poetic as always on the subject and describes the naval battle like this. When radiant like the destroyer of Pura, he besieged Puri, the fortune of the western sea, with hundreds of ships resembling arrays of rutting elephants, the sky dark blue like a young lotus and covered with tiers of massive clouds mirrored the sea, and the sea in turn mirrored the sky. This is explanation enough. After he was done with the Mauryas, the principalities of the Latas, the Malavas, and the Gurjaras became, and I quote, models of how vassals once subdued by force should conduct themselves. Essentially, it means that these three kingdoms decided to become feudatories of Pulakesin II without offering any resistance. A smart move on their behalf. The Lata region is the southern part of Gujarat, Malava is Malwa, and Gurjara is, as now, the area straddling Gujarat and Maharashtra. The bit about how conquered feudatories must conduct themselves meant they offered themselves as vassals to Pulakesin without a fight. If we stop to take stock of the kingdom, now Pulakesin stood, the undisputed king of an area that stretched from the south of Vatapi through the west coast areas of Goa and Konkana, the Midlands and central India, through southern Gujarat, and the areas that we know now as Malwa and Gurjara. There was one remaining issue that lay to the south, and this was the domain of the Gangas. They ruled the area that we know today as a part of Greater Bangalore. The Gangas had always been stubbornly defiant as a kingdom. Right through history, every attempt to conquer them or even subjugate them had resulted at best in making them close allies, even if they were happy to act as junior allies. And ruling the Gangas at the present time was the veteran, the man about whom I devoted an entire earlier episode, Durvinita Ganga. If you haven't done so, you must listen to that story of that remarkable man. Now let me remind you briefly that when Durvinita's father Avanita had chosen to hand over the Ganga kingdom to a younger son, Durvinita had decided to take the throne by force, his by right. The Pallavas, who had been long-standing friends of the Gangas up to that point, had decided to side with their old pal Avanita. Helpless and robbed of his birthright, Durvinita turned to the Chalukyas for help. This could have been during the time of Pulakesin I. The Chalukyas helped Durvinita defeat his brother and ascend to the throne. It was also pragmatic and convenient for the Chalukyas. The Pallavas were starting to get ambitious and territorial, and the Gangas were a formidable doorstop in the area. And given that alliance with the Chalukyas, in later years, Durvinita had carried out very successful attacks against the Pallavas right inside their heartland, as the battles at Andheri, Alattur, Polilur, and Peranagara would all become a part of history. Years later at the present time, Pulakesin II had been robbed of his birthright, and he had a situation that Durvinita understood very well. And now the time came for Durvinita to be able to return the favor to the Chalukyas, to the younger man, the prince who would be king. So joining the force comprising the Banas and possibly the west coast Alupas, Durvinita's formidable Ganga army joined the battle at Elpattu Simbighe when Mangalesha was killed, and Pulakesin II became the king of the Chalukyas and the overlord of all the feudatory kingdoms. But never the ones to become feudatories in the sense of obedient vassals, Durvinita offered to Pulakesin II the hand in marriage of his daughter, Ganga Mahadevi, an alliance that made these two dynasties family, and the Gangavadi was no longer an issue for Pulakesin II. And to have a father-in-law like Durvinita was the bonus any king would have sought. And there we have Pulakesin II, less than a single decade after his accession to the throne, the king of all the western Deccan, a man who only seemed to be getting stronger with every campaign, every challenge, every year. He had overcome a treacherous uncle, quelled a civil war, staved off an open challenge from the northern territories, smashed the Kadambas into obscurity, and by a combination of astute statesmanship and merciless warfare, he had, by his own effort, subjugated or co-opted the provinces of the Alupas, the Mauryas, the Latas, the Malavas, and the Gurjaras. And with Durvinita becoming someone that he could address as Appa, the Gangavadi and the Punata provinces were his by proxy. Pulakesin II could not have been happier. The court of the Chalukya kingdom was his, and the kingdom of Chalukya, his grandfather's dream realized. In the next episode, the international reach of Pulakesin, the visit of the Chinese scholar Xuanzang, and the Pallava Wars, and one of the most important battles the young Pulakesin ever fought, the Battle of Narmada against the yet undefeated Harshavardhana. All that coming up next in this exciting journey. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the History of Bangalore.